In assessing the meaning and implications of LSD for science, society, and culture, a small subject, it's helpful to survey the various groups of people that were involved with the drug before it became illegal in the mid-1960s. These groups, representing disparate segments of society, had a wide range of ideas about LSD and how it could best be used to advance their specific agendas. So let's start with the scientific pioneers who began experimenting with LSD in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They saw LSD as a powerful instrument for studying how the mind works, a long-awaited chemical key for unlocking the mysteries of brain chemistry and mental illness. This exciting new research tool was a boon for neuroscience. LSD gave rise to novel theories about the biochemical basis of schizophrenia and possible remedies for this perplexing malady. Very early on, LSD was also embraced, albeit secretly, by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency as a potential new agent for unconventional warfare. This is how LSD, excuse me? Cell phones off, please. Okay. So in CIA documents from the early 1950s, LSD is described as a potential new agent for unconventional warfare. At a time when society at large knew precious little about LSD, it was viewed by American spy chiefs as a terrifically potent, mind-altering substance that held the promise of revolutionizing the cloak and dagger trade and affording U.S. intelligence a decisive advantage over its Cold War rivals. The U.S. military also had high hopes for LSD. U.S. Army strategists were smitten by the prospect of deploying LSD as a psychochemical weapon. Spray a cloud of madness gas over a big city and you can incapacitate the entire population without killing anybody. This was their idea. LSD raised the possibility of a new kind of battle weapon that would supposedly usher in an era of war without death. Now, by the late 1950s, a growing number of psychiatrists and doctors were touting LSD as a healing agent that facilitated and sped up the process of psychotherapy. LSD had an uncanny ability to make the unconscious conscious, to illuminate long-hidden sources of neurotic behavior by bringing to the surface whatever might be lurking in the depths of the mind, hence the word psychedelic, which literally means mind manifesting. Now, during the 1960s, the therapeutic potential of LSD was projected onto a broad social landscape. LSD was trumpeted by Timothy Leary and others as a potential cure-all for a sick society, a species catalyst capable of catapulting humanity to the next evolutionary level. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back and see that every group of people who got involved with LSD was very excited about the possibilities conjured by the drug. They all saw it as the key to the big breakthrough for their respective areas of concern. In each case, the encounter with LSD triggered an envisioning of new possibilities. Whether or not these different possibilities would ever be actualized is another matter, but the opening, the awakened sense of potential was real. Now, taking LSD does not mean that a person's consciousness will automatically be expanded or that he or she will necessarily have a particular kind of religious experience or live a spiritual life thereafter. But LSD does radically alter one's sense of time, and in some cases, the dazzling immediacy and experiential density of LSD are conducive to deep insight and self-discovery. How we experience time, past, present, and future, was pondered at great length by the German phenomenologist Martin Heidegger, who, despite his flirtation with Nazism, is considered one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century. It's rumored that Heidegger took LSD in the late 1950s with his close friend and mentor, Ernst Jünger, the German writer. Now, be that as it may, Heidegger in his writings distinguished between an authentic and inauthentic experience of the three modes of time. An authentic experience of the present, according to Heidegger, entails a moment of vision, a revelatory glimpse of one's own most potentiality for being which cannot be outstripped. That's how Heidegger referred to it, one's ownmost potentiality for being which cannot be outstripped. Now, LSD has a propensity for catalyzing intensely meaningful moments of vision. Now, when I refer to vision, I'm not talking about the shape-shifting hallucinogenic imagery, the retinal circus that one sees on LSD. Rather, I'm alluding to those seminal light bulb moments, those explosive epiphanies, which alter mental constructs and change how we look at things. The phrase high on LSD implies rising above the ordinary and getting a long-range, overarching view. What was once unimagined suddenly becomes saturated with possibility. LSD-induced moments of vision can be both uniquely personal and transpersonal. Sometimes they spring full-blown from the hallucinating brains of artists and scientists, and a ripple effect is felt throughout society. Consider the case of Kary Mullis, who won the 1993 Nobel Prize for Chemistry for his invention of the polymerase chain reaction, a system for multiplying minute amounts of DNA for research. Mullis says he probably would have never made his discovery had he not taken LSD, which showed, in his own words, how to get down there with the molecules. LSD and DNA seem to have an ongoing thing for each other. Thomas Crick, the Nobel Prize-winning father of modern genetics, was under the influence of LSD when he first perceived the double helix shape of DNA. That was a half-century ago. In 2004, this was 10 years after Crick's death, the British press disclosed that Crick had confided to a fellow scientist that he and other Cambridge academics occasionally used LSD as a thinking tool to liberate themselves from preconceptions and allow their genius to forage freely and explore new ideas. Crick said that LSD helped him discover the structure of DNA, the secret of life itself, a feat which earned him the Nobel Prize, along with American co-researcher James Watson, although I think the significant contribution of a female associate was overlooked by the Nobel Committee. Now, Crick's LSD confession is all the more intriguing in light of Jeremy Narby's remarkable treatise on the correspondence between the double helix DNA configuration and the prevalence of snakes and serpentine motifs in ayahuasca visions. Jeremy will be talking about this, so I don't have to say anything more about that, except for the suggestion that there seems to be some kind of cross-cultural phenomenon at work here, which would mean that Crick's discovery of the DNA shape merely confirmed what had long been intuited by shamans and primitive societies. Now, the holy trinity of plant, person, planet figured prominently in another LSD-inspired vision with potentially far-reaching social and cultural implications. Jack Hare, the U.S. businessman turned cannabis crusader, was high on LSD when he had his herbal epiphany about hemp. It was Hare who came up with the unified field theory of hemp as a sustainable, eco-friendly source of fiber, fuel, food, as well as medicine and recreation. Hare insists that hemp could save the world, and he credits LSD for this insight. His messianic zeal notwithstanding, it's a compelling spiel in many ways. Hare's ideas have been gaining converts and momentum since he started hipping folks to hemp in the early 1980s. Wavy Gravy, who was one of the merry pranksters with Ken Kesey in the 1960s, and it was also the MC of the Woodstock Music Festival, the famous festival. He likes to liven up mass gatherings these days by proclaiming, "Hemp, hemp, hooray." And who among us here would disagree with that? Let me give one more example of an LSD-instigated vision whose impact continues to reverberate around the world. Captain Al Hubbard, the improbable American spy come uranium entrepreneur, had a eureka moment during his maiden LSD voyage in the early 1950s when he witnessed his own conception. He saw his mother and father making love, sperm and egg, meeting, and so he was totally blown away by this. And Hubbard had the means and enthusiasm to spread the good word and the drug itself. He became the first Johnny Appleseed of LSD, flying around in his own airplane and turning on thousands of people, including several scientists and doctors who became notable LSD researchers in their own right. One of those is Myron Stolaroff, who I think is participating in the conference. And that's significant because the captain, he was a legend among the early computer cognoscenti in Palo Alto, California, where in the mid-1960s, people like Stolaroff and others who had been trained by the captain gave LSD to the emerging stars of the cyber community. These turned-on high-tech prodigies were designing and using computers to push the edges of the possible and permissible, in the words of Stuart Brandt. Brandt was the organizer of the San Francisco Trips Festival in 1966, and he was later founder and editor of the Whole Earth Catalog and was an important person in the whole computer scene as it was taking shape early on. Now, I'm sure other people at this conference will elaborate upon the role that LSD played in thrusting us willy-nilly into the vortex of the information economy, but just think for a moment how amazing this is. LSD catalyzed the vision of the DNA double helix, the building block of life itself, and science and medicine have never been the same since. And the same drug also galvanized the cybernetic revolution, which has transformed global commerce and communication. It's obvious from these examples that LSD has had an immense impact on science and society. And of course, there's a whole other dimension to this, which I barely touched on. A discernible youth culture started to emerge in the mid-1960s, just when the use of street acid became widespread among teenagers and 20-somethings in North America and Europe. Poetry, music, literature, cinema, fashion, the visual arts were all influenced by psychedelic drugs. And one shouldn't underestimate the extent to which LSD facilitated the rise in popularity of organic food, alternative healing, environmentalism, Buddhist meditation, neo-pagan earth rituals, and the like. LSD also influenced how political dissent was expressed during the 1960s. It was part and parcel of a many-sided youth rebellion whose tentacles reached to the heights of ego-dissolving delirium, a rebellion as much concerned with the sexual and spiritual as with anything traditionally political. For the lyrical left, acid amplified the core belief that the personal is political, that politics should be relevant to one's lived experience. So by way of a conclusion, let me say, while the molecular makeup of LSD does not contain an intrinsic political ideology, it has propelled many people to imagine new life possibilities. It gave some of us a glimpse of our own most potentiality for being, which cannot be outstripped. LSD may not have provided the practical means for transmuting this vision into a healthier life or a better world, but it did convey a potent message that still resonates. If politics is the art of the possible, as the saying goes, and the personal is truly political, then we all must be artists of the possible. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm an anthropologist. 500 years ago, in this country, people who knew about healing and plants were burned at the stake. In the French-speaking part of Switzerland, 5,000 people, mainly women, were burned between 1500 and 1700. That's one person every 15 days for 200 years. The culture that was in Europe at that point, I would compare to a kind of Taliban culture, extremely intolerant of knowledge about plants and healing. Meanwhile, Europeans started spreading out around the world, arrived in the Americas around this time, beginning of the 16th century, and they found people who would take plants, go into trance states, and claim that they could heal people. And from 1500 to 1700, essentially the European observers were priests. And what they saw was ministers of the devil. They didn't even have the word shaman. The word shaman comes from Siberia, came into European languages later. There was a lack of words in European languages for these practitioners besides sorcerer. They didn't really know what to call them. But they found them wherever they went. Among the Sioux, among the Tupi-Guarani, wherever they went, there were these kinds of practitioners. For the first 200 years of written texts that Europeans left, these people were called ministers of the devil. Then rationalism happened. And the first rational observers, like Diderot, who composed the encyclopedia with his colleagues, they were open-minded in the 18th century. And the way they defined, the first definition of shaman is to be found in Diderot's encyclopedia. And Diderot defined a shaman as an impostor who claims to communicate with the devil. And this was open-mindedness in the 18th century. And actually, it was a step up in the world for shamans, because if you're an imposter, there is no reason to burn you. Well, it's hard to do 500 years intellectual history in less than 10 minutes. But when anthropology was born in the second half of the 19th century, it got off to a bad start because it was the science that proposed to study inferior societies, primitive people. In other words, it got off to a racist start. And the point was to go to these far-flung places and study these strange cultures. And of course, the strangest among these strange cultures were shamans. And anthropologists have been trying to wrap their minds around just what are these shamans? Well, at the beginning of the 20th century, the anthropological consensus was that shamans were people who are mentally deranged. They're psychotics. They're people who take their hallucinations seriously. And it's all just superstition. It's hocus pocus. There's nothing real that is there. Well, when scientists started looking into mescaline and then LSD, they discovered that actually there are substances that do modify your mind, and you can actually try them. And when anthropologists, after LSD got into the scientific culture in the 50s, and anthropologists started drinking ayahuasca, like Michael Harner in 1961 among the Conibo in the Peruvian Amazon, or eating psilocybin mushrooms, they started to be able to see for themselves what shamans around the world had been talking about for centuries. Essentially, LSD helped anthropology take indigenous people and their knowledge systems seriously, for which I thank Albert Hofmann. Martin Lee was, I associate him with 3 times 3 letters, LSD, CIA, and KGB. But, and I was going to do something fancy and talk about LSD, DNA, and PCR, but he beat me to it. So I won't go over that ground. I'd just like to point out that what PCR is, most people don't know this. Kary Mullis's invention or discovery is the main technique that allows all the biotechnology work that goes on in labs now to happen. It allows you to amplify a precise gene, make millions of copies of it, and work with it. It allows you to manipulate DNA. You can't work on DNA without this technique. It is the fundamental technique and biological technical discovery of the 20th century. And Kary Mullis says that he dreamed it up while under the influence of LSD. Kary Mullis says that what he likes to do is take LSD, wander around the woods, and think grandiose thoughts. Well, I'll share a scoop here with you. I like to do that myself. And when I was working on my book, The Cosmic Serpent, I'd been stumped for months as to, so is what the shamans say correct? Or is it what the scientists are saying about what goes on in the brain with ayahuasca? Is it something that happens inside the head, or does the information come from outside? So I was mulling over this stuff, and one spring day, when the flowers were bursting near this town I live in Fribourg, Switzerland, I went into a nature reserve and took some LSD and started wandering around thinking about this stuff. And suddenly I could see my own presuppositions, and I think this is one of the things that LSD is good for. I could see that I'm a Westerner, and I tend to dichotomize things. And here I am wandering around, is it inside or outside? Is it the shamans or is it the scientists? Maybe it's both at the same time. Look for a combination. Look for a scientific equivalent of what the shamans are saying. Maybe it's both inside and outside the head. yeah, I hadn't thought of it like that. So I went back to my office, and in subsequent days, it was literally 10 days later that I made the connection between DNA and shamanism that is the subject of that book. And to this day, I think the whole point is to strive towards bicognitivism and to open up our minds to the fact that there are several ways of knowing. Rationalism is a strong and fine way of knowing, but it's not the only one and can be complemented with another angle. And I thank LSD for opening my mind to such possibilities. Finally, I'd end by saying the other day, this journalist called me up, wanted to talk about LSD, and she's from the French-speaking part of Switzerland, where people are a little less tolerant of these things. So I didn't know, exactly what foot to dance on, so we were talking. I said, well, one thing is that millions of people, ordinary people, not scientists or anthropologists or artists, just ordinary people have taken LSD and ended up on their knees in the woods looking at the ants and admiring their intelligence. And she said, yes, I did that. That was me, And so most people here are Westerners. We tend to have dichotomies in our head. That's our culture. We come out of a culture that has separated us from nature in our minds. And if there is a substance that can break down these barriers and get millions of Westerners down on their knees admiring the ants, I think this is a good thing.
Well, good morning, everyone. By way of introduction, I'm first off an LSD casualty. I took a large amount of LSD in my first semester of college and promptly decided to drop out for 10 years. I'm a LSD success story. In some ways, I returned back to college in order to become a psychedelic therapist. And then years later, MDMA and LSD motivated me to try to start a nonprofit pharmaceutical company to move these drugs through the system to make them back into prescription medicines. And then later, LSD, MDMA, and marijuana inspired me to give up my efforts primarily to become a psychedelic therapist and to focus on the politics that stands in the way of the work. And so I went to Harvard and have a PhD from the Kennedy School of Government in the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana. So with that, I'm now working actively to try to develop psychedelics as medicine. I've got 4 talks that I'll be giving at this conference and 2 seminars. And so I've structured it where this talk is the big vision, where I won't get much into details. The intermediate talks are more about the politics, the protocols, and then the psychedelics, which drugs we decide to use for different substances. And then the final talk on Sunday morning will be about the vision made practical, whether it is a crazy idea for us to think that we don't need governments, we don't need big pharmaceutical companies, we don't need big granting agencies to do the work to make psychedelics, LSD, MDMA into prescription medicines. And so with that as the overview, now the big vision for me is that psychedelics have a fundamental role as a potential tool in helping for the survival of the human species and also for helping us really to flourish. And that's a very big vision, and one of the ways in which that vision inspires me, why it's so necessary, is because there's incredible obstacles in trying to start research and trying to move forward, and it's necessary to be sustained by the big vision in order to be able to do the detailed work. So for example, we've been now trying in the United States for over almost 3 years to buy 10 grams of marijuana from the government. The government has a monopoly on the supply. They have poor quality marijuana, and they hold it, they have 900,000 grams in stock. And despite massive lawyers, thousands and thousands of dollars of lawyers, we've been unable, after all these years, to buy 10 grams for marijuana vaporizer research. And at the same time, though, we've had to spend 18 years, I've spent trying to start MDMA research from the time it was criminalized in 1986 to 2004 when Dr. Michael Mithofer, who's here, was able, working with us, to get permission for the first therapeutic study of MDMA which is for post-traumatic stress disorder. So that in all those 18 years and all this time, the vision is what really is the inspirational sustenance. And so I'd like now to briefly quote Albert Einstein, who I think points the way to the really crucial importance of psychedelics. I don't think he was meaning it in that way, but I think that's the implications of what he was saying. What Albert Einstein said was, quote, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. What shall be required if mankind is to survive is a whole new mode of thinking." Now, what I hear him saying is that the mode of thinking that has to be developed is because, in part, we are massively overdeveloped intellectually as a species and as individuals, and incredibly underdeveloped emotionally. And that this fundamental imbalance, that the tools we have created by technology, I thought what Albert said this morning about moving back away from technology more towards appreciation, I think that's, we can never do that. We can't move back. We have to work with the technology. We live in this technological world. We have to develop the appreciation for nature and then work to inform how we deal with technology. And I think in a way that's what he was saying too. But I think that one part is using psychedelics to achieve this emotional balance, and the psychotherapy in all different ways to bring up to the fore the feelings. For me, I was sort of frozen emotionally. Psychedelics unfroze that, put me in touch with my emotions, and helped me in this way. I had hoped in my bar mitzvah when I was sort of 13 years old, and expecting that that ritual would turn me into a man. And that's what I was really hoping. Somehow I would skip the difficulties of adolescence, that this ritual that had been handed down for thousands of years, that it would do the trick, and I would be different in the morning. And I remember in the morning, in bed afterwards, thinking, well, God didn't show up. I'm not any different. It must have been a busy Saturday. There must have been a lot of people bar mitzvah today, and he'll get around to me. He will get around to me. And it didn't happen. And so I also feel that for rites of passage, rituals, the psychedelics can revitalize them, and we need to focus on trying to help that happen as well. But the other part of the psychedelic vision, the new modes of thinking, is this mystical sense that psychedelics can help us. And so now, in order to look at the political implications of the mystical experience, I'm going to need to talk a little bit about the Good Friday experiment. And so I'm wondering, how many people have heard about the Good Friday experiment? Okay, good, a fair number, but this was one of the major contributions of Timothy Leary when he was still working within the academic context, when he was still trying to do research. And there was a lot of talk about the religious aspects of psychedelics, and he wanted to put it to the test. And so they arranged for a study. Walter Pankey did it for his PhD. He was both a doctor and a minister, and it was with psilocybin, 30 milligrams of psilocybin, and they took 20 divinity students into church on Good Friday, and half had placebo and half had the psilocybin. And they developed a questionnaire of the mystical experience separated from the different religions, sort of the core elements of the mystical experience. And they wanted to see, were religiously inclined people in a religious setting likely to have a more religious mystical experience because of the psilocybin? And they actually then discovered that they did. Now, at this time, Martin Luther King's mentor, Reverend Howard Thurman, was the minister at Boston University Chapel, and he agreed to let this take place in his chapel. So we have now an example back then of where psychedelics were not seen as revolutionary counterculture, but within the constructs of the society, they were able to be used and explored. Now, Walter Pankey, who did this study, died in a tragic scuba diving accident in 1971. And what I recognized also in the mystical literature, it's not so much the description of the experience that counts. It's the fruits test. And so by that, the fruit of the tree is how you determine the validity of mystical experience. Does it have good, positive, growthful effects in the person's life? And in the middle 80s, it was impossible to get permission for psychedelic research, but it was possible to do a follow-up study to the Good Friday experiment. because that wasn't involving actually giving psychedelics. It was involving asking people what their long-term impressions were. And this study was so suppressed at the time that Andover Newton Theological Seminary, where the students came from, didn't even have a copy in their library of the thesis of the Good Friday experiment. Not only that, they refused to help me to find the people who were in the study. But I was able in the library to discover an old alumni list, and I was able to use that to do a mass mailing, and eventually I contacted 19 out of the 20. And so what I found was this. Quote, each of the psilocybin subjects felt that the experience had significantly affected his life in a positive way and expressed appreciation for having participated in the experiment. Most of the effects discussed in the long-term follow-up interviews centered around enhanced appreciation of life and of nature, deepened sense of joy, deepened commitment to the Christian ministry or to whatever other vocations they'd chosen since, enhanced appreciation of unusual experiences and emotions, increased tolerance of other religious systems, deepened equanimity in the face of difficult life crises, and greater solidarity and identification with foreign peoples, minorities, women, and nature. So what this shows is the political implications of the mystical experience. And when we look at the 60s, there's a tendency to talk about Timothy Leary ruining it and people having all these difficult experiences and all these casualties, of which there were many. So it's not the case that psychedelics were an easy tool. There were a lot of problems caused by misuse. But the idea that these drugs were criminalized because of psychedelic experiences going wrong, I think misses the point. I think they were criminalized because of psychedelic experiences going right. When people have this sense of unity underneath their country, underneath their religion, underneath their gender, underneath their race, it tends to make you more compassionate and more open-minded and less chauvinistic. Now, I think that the idea that psychedelics are inherently countercultural, that's one of the main points I'm going to be making this whole conference, is that that is a fundamental trap, a self-destructive concept that breeds the resistance that you're trying to avoid. So I think if we conceive of psychedelics as fundamentally countercultural, that we're always going to have this inherent conflict with the culture, we're never going to be able to integrate them, we're going to be building our own enemies, and I don't think that that's necessary. And I think the example of Eleusis for 2,000 years embedded in the culture is a lesson to us, and we have to find new ways to try to do that within our own cultural context. But getting out of the mindset of thinking of ourselves as criminals, as against the system, and also of having such revolutionary information that the whole systems need to crumble. I don't think that that's the case. So I think how we perceive of it, how we deal with the police, how we deal with the authorities, it's good for them to let us move forward. It's good for the police to sell me 10 grams of marijuana. They don't realize it yet. They will eventually. But that's, I think, in the heart of hearts, is working with the police authorities to think that. Now, okay, I'm going to close now with a quote from Stan Grof. We're publishing his new book. This is the last paragraph of working with the terminally ill and how he approaches people that are dying. So this is the elaboration of the big vision. As a combination of unbridled greed, malignant aggression, and existence of weapons of mass destruction threatens the survival of humanity and possibly life on this planet, we must seriously consider any avenue that offers some hope. However implausible the idea of profound, large-scale psychospiritual transformation might appear, the fact that it can occur regularly on an individual basis is highly significant. In my experience, individuals who are able to confront death and come to terms with it in their inner process tend to develop a sense of planetary citizenship, reverence for life in all its forms, deep ecological sensitivity, spirituality of a universal and all-encompassing type, aversion to violence, and an aversion to view aggression as an acceptable form of conflict resolution. Such radical inner transformation and rise to a new level of consciousness might be humanity's only real chance for survival. Thank you.